As is tradition, we're keeping it here. Let's welcome on Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, how are you this afternoon?
I'm fine, but I forgot to vote this morning also.
Oh, we need all the help we can get down here with this mayoral race. And this was a fun idea. At least I hope it's fun. Because we've even had people call this show, Judge, saying that people don't trust this local Montgomery election. Now, they can't always articulate why, but they're citing what happened in the 2020 presidential election. But this growing distrust, and there's always been questioning of elections, but this deep distrust that seems to have grown, is this a good thing or a bad thing? How could this shape out?
Well, it's bad because it interferes with personal liberty, where the government gets in your face and in your living room and in your bank book and in the classroom, intrudes itself between parent and child, steals money and gives it away, steals money and fights undeclared wars. It's a good thing because sometimes people get fed up and there's a non-bloody revolution, sort of like we had when Ronald Reagan threw Jimmy Carter out of the White House. So people need to get fed up by it and vote for candidates who will leave them alone and confine the behavior of the government to that which is authorized just by, in Alabama's case, the state constitution and the federal constitution. But look, the government knows how to stay in power. It bribes the rich with bailouts and the middle class with tax cuts and the poor with wealth transfers, and it just keeps borrowing money in order to finance all of this, and the beneficiaries of it just keep electing not always the same people, but the same mentality to government. In Washington, we have the welfare warfare party. They are both Republicans and Democrats. They are 95% of the Congress. Tommy Tuberville is an exception. Rand Paul is an exception. Thomas Massie is an exception. You can count those exceptions on your hands and feet, and you wouldn't use all your fingers and toes. The rest just want government to keep growing and keep regulating. And that's what's happening. And that's what people are getting fed up with.
Well, and it really is a shame to see this in this country, but I worry about folks who, as the cool kids online say, are black-pilled or who are despairing. And it's one thing to be despairing, like, whatever we do, it's not going to work out. It's another thing, though, to be clear-eyed. For a second there, you're sounding like one of your tentpole guests there on Judging Freedom, Doug McGregor. A little later in the program, if we have time on Election Day, we're going to play his sit-down with Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you had a chance to see that. It dropped last night. Tucker stealing your best guest, but
we have different audiences.
Fair enough, but the analysis is sobering, and that the donor class and the uniparty runs everything, and I worry that if folks lose completely all hope that voting or elections can change anything, then we're really in a dangerous spot to where it, as you said, it needs to be a nonviolent revolution, not something in the streets. In Ukraine, continuing down this road, they're not winning. That's at least my sense. The Ukrainians are not winning. I don't think really anybody's winning out of this with the number of dead, but from all your great guests, and you have Doug McGregor and many others that we could mention, but from your conversations with those great guests, what is happening in Ukraine right now?
Ukraine is losing terribly. Its spring offensive is gone. Its winter offensive has been a disaster. The Russians have built 3 rungs of defenses in front of their troops in eastern Ukraine. The Russians haven't even approached, much less breached, the first of those 3 rings.
For the Ukrainians.
President Zelensky gave a speech outside the Parliament in Copenhagen yesterday, thanking them for F-16s. By the time those F-16s arrive, President Zelensky will be in his villa in Miami or his townhouse in Paris, and his government will have collapsed. It's hard to imagine that the Ukraine military can survive much longer. This will probably end when military commanders say, we can't do this anymore. We can't go into certain defeat, which produces nothing. Our lives would be better if we surrendered than if we stayed and fought. That's what President Putin, who doesn't want to fight the war anymore either, doesn't want to govern Ukraine, but that's the impression he's trying to give to Ukrainian soldiers. You'd be better off surrendering and waiting for this to end than you would be entering this meat grinder.
Well, and from the open sources that are out there, if you can find it, folks, I mean, some videos you probably don't want to see. From some of the stuff I've seen, I wish I hadn't. But it's out there, and it is the modern war. You thought it's always been hell, but modern war, the way it's working with the ISR strike systems, and like nobody's safe on the ground. And what's a shame to me, Judge, what has me quite worried and apprehensive, is I have never known my country in my lifetime. I'll be 35 in December. I've never known my country not at war. But the wars we've been in my lifetime, okay, we stayed in Afghanistan for 2 decades. We stayed in Iraq for a long, long time. We've been all over the world. We go down the list. But it wasn't like big players, messing up. What's the ramifications for the American people back home? But if they do the same thing with Russia, I don't think you can treat Putin like Saddam or Gaddafi or the Taliban. This is a different nation.
Your observations are very astute, Joey, consistent with the arguments from a lot of the people that I have on my show, not the least of whom is Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter, guys who have been in battle, in McGregor's case, for the bulk of his professional career. You're exactly right. We fought wars against countries that were much smaller and not nearly as well equipped as us, and we lost them. We've never fought. The last major war we fought was World War II. The Russian army is better than ours. The Chinese Navy and Air Force is bigger and better than ours. We spend more money than the next 12 countries combined, including Russia and China, on the military, but we waste it. Part of what that big government pro-war party does is to spread the military-industrial complex all around the country, so that when members of Congress even think about shrinking the Defense Department budget, the editorialists will say, well, you're going to put half of this town out of work if you close this plant down or if you reduce the demands from it. Like I said, the government bribes the rich with bailouts or with contracts for their corporations paid for by debt. It's a very, very vicious, dangerous circle. How many military installations do we have around the world? 903. No human being has been to all of them. No human being can list all of them. No human being can justify the majority of them. How many in Italy alone? 112. What? 2 of them have nuclear weapons there. This is crazy. Members of Congress don't even know this, but under presidents and secretaries of defense of both parties, from and after World War II, the military-industrial complex has become one of the most dangerous features in American life, and it's below the radar.
And when I look at the politicians, though, like in that conversation between Doug McGregor and Tucker Carlson, Tucker brought up Chris Christie. He played a clip actually for McGregor to react to. And you know Chris Christie well. Is it just a matter of, he's very saying we need to do more in Ukraine. Is it a matter of donors? Or does he really believe it? Like, I'm trying, and I'm not picking on him. It's just the example that comes to mind.
Well, the donors do drive the message. In Governor Christie's case, I think he honestly believes, I disagree with this. I disagree with it morally, politically, legally, and historically. But Governor Christie believes that Vladimir Putin will attack another country if he prevails in Ukraine, the sort of domino theory, and therefore he must be stopped in Ukraine. I think he probably also believes, along with the neocons, that we should use Ukraine as a battering ram to make President Putin unhappy, unwanted, unpopular, and drive him from office. So our battering ram and our sanctions have had the opposite effect. The sanctions have hurt Western Europe, not Russia. The battering ram has hurt boys and men in Ukraine. President Putin has an 82% approval rating amongst the Russian populace. I don't think Governor Christie is corrupt. I don't think he is motivated by what his donors want. I think he is sort of an old-fashioned, um, uh, let's fear the domino theory Republican. I'm not a fan of Ron DeSantis, and I can't imagine Trump getting reelected, but I agree with the two of them on Ukraine. It's none of our business. It's a border dispute. We should stay the hell out.
And in just a second, I want to get to your op-ed before I let you go. But another guy, this guy just came to mind. I don't think I've asked you about him. Vivek Ramaswamy seems great on this issue of Ukraine and a lot of other issues. But what's your read on that guy? I'm asking everybody I know.
I don't have much of a read on him. Some of what he says is quite libertarian. He believes you own your own body and you can decide what to put in your own body. Some of it is quite traditional. He believes that the nuclear family, husband, wife, children living together, parents educating the children and having control over their education, is a backbone of Western society. I agree with that. Neither of them is a federal issue. So I don't know where he is on the size of the federal government or keeping it chained down to the Constitution. He did say he thought the Constitution was the greatest defense of human liberty. It's been a dismal, miserable, horrific failure. It doesn't protect human liberty and it doesn't restrain the federal government. Only nullification and secession, the states nullifying federal laws as they pertain to those states, or the states seceding from the Union as they tried at time before the war between the states. Only that will keep the federal government in check. Could you imagine if the feds couldn't tax people in Texas, the income of people in Texas? That might change their attitude about the level of taxation.
Wow. And you're right with what you said about the Constitution. I've come to firmly believe that only men, not laws, can wrestle with their fate. Laws are produced by good men. They don't necessarily make good men. And if bad people come around, well, they'll use and abuse, even in the name of a certain document or principle, they'll use and abuse it for their own selfish ends. And to that point, your op-ed last week that dropped last Thursday, it had a provocative title, right? When the First Amendment dies, but this has to do with a search warrant that was granted. It ends up with somebody dead. Could you tell the story and tell us what happened here?
So a small town newspaper, 1,900 people in the town, was the victim of a vendetta by a restaurant owner. The newspaper was about to write a negative restaurant review, which was going to point out that the restaurant owner who was seeking a liquor license herself had a DWI, which in Kansas, I suppose, is disabling for the liquor license. And so the restaurant owner went to the police and said the only way they could have gotten my DWI was to engage in identity theft. Police accepted this, didn't run it past a prosecutor or a town or a county lawyer, just went directly to a judge who signed a search warrant. These cops showed up and ransacked the newspaper office and took servers and personal mobile devices. Where's the boss? The boss is at home. They went to his home, broke down the door, ransacked the home in the presence of his 98-year-old mother who dropped dead. There's a federal statute that prohibits raids on newspapers. There is case law that says when what you're looking for is in the possession of a third-party custodian, they're looking for the contents of this. Yeah, it's in here, but Google or Facebook or Verizon or AT&T, or whoever your provider is, has it also. You serve a subpoena on the third-party provider. You serve a copy on the person whose documents you want, so they have the opportunity to challenge the subpoena. This was an effort to chill the First Amendment protected freedoms of this newspaper. And it drew the wrath of Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, progressives, libertarians from all across the country, to the point where the local prosecutor said, I better look into this. And he looked at the affidavit that went to the judge and said, this does not justify a search warrant. We're going to rescind it. Now, of course, this small town, 5 cops, all of whom had to come in to serve this search warrant on a Friday evening, this small town's going to owe the newspaper a fortune. This is one of the 1,000 little cuts that the government has inflicted on either the freedom of speech or the freedom of the press. Scare the daylights out of the journalists, and they won't print anything negative about you. After the raid was over, it turns out that we learned that this newspaper was also preparing a negative piece about the chief of the 5-person police department. Can't make this stuff up.
Well, and it's a reminder to folks here locally that, yes, local elections, local officials, who's around you locally still does matter, even though we're awash in national narratives. I always appreciate your time, Judge. Well, before you go, what's coming up on Judging Freedom on your podcast?
I have Kevin Demerit, who's the founder of Lear Capital and a good friend of mine, is going to talk about gold at 2:00, and at 3:30, the great Larry Johnson. How bad is Ukraine actually losing this war, and why don't we know it? Much of what you and I discussed a few minutes ago.
Well, I appreciate your time as always. It's a must-see, must-listen podcast show, folks. And until next week, I appreciate it, Judge.
Thank you, Joey. All the best.